The plate was still warm in my hands when my daughter-in-law's mother slapped it to the floor. Gravy, glass, and dignity splattered across my carpet. Still, I didn't raise my voice. I just watched her smirk like she'd won something. As the scent of roast beef thickened in the air, so did my resolve. While they laughed at my silence, I slid open the drawer with the papers I'd been saving. The same calm they mocked was the warning they missed. That's when I served the real course. 15 days to get out of my house. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The smell of roast beef hung in the air, rich and savory, weaving through the open space of Helen's modest dining room. The mashed potatoes were perfectly whipped, creamy, the edges just golden enough to hold their form. She had slaved over it for hours, every dish arranged with care on the heavy oak table, a centerpiece that hadn't changed in years. There was no need to say it out loud, but she knew the meal meant something. Family, tradition, the effort she had put in to make this right. But there was something about the way Yvette stared at the platter as Helen set it down that made the air shift. A strange sort of tension clung to her. Yvette, perched at the head of the table, flicked her eyes from the roast to the mashed potatoes, her lips curving in the slightest disdainful twist. "Too dry," Yvette muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, her sharp voice cutting through the room like a blade through soft butter. Brooke, sitting beside her, let out a nervous laugh, too quick, too high. She pressed a hand to her chest, almost as if the sound of her own laughter was trying to reassure them all. It didn't. Helen's hand tightened on the edge of the platter, her fingers white against the porcelain. Her years of practice at holding herself in check were the only thing that kept her from flinching. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood still, feeling the heat in the room rise. It was then that Yvette, with a speed that surprised everyone, reached out. Her fingers caught the corner of the platter, tipping it just enough for the contents to shift. A moment of confused silence before the full weight of the gesture landed. The roast, the potatoes, the vegetables, everything flew into the air. And then the plate hit the floor with a sickening crash. Meat and potatoes scattered across the carpet, the sound echoing in the quiet house like a gunshot. The glass platter shattered in slow motion, pieces of it skittering out across the floor in jagged little triangles. For a moment, no one moved. The room, so familiar and warm just seconds before, now felt like a frozen lake, the air impossibly thin. Sean's voice broke the stillness. "Let's just eat." He muttered it under his breath, as though saying the words could make the scene disappear, like nothing had happened. But Helen didn't move. Her heart beat a little faster, a rush of blood pressing to her temples, but she stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on the mess at her feet. She felt the sting of humiliation crawl up her neck, but she wasn't going to show it. Not now. Not for her. Liam, quiet as always, seemed the only one who understood. His eyes, wide with concern, met hers across the table. "Grandma, are you okay?" The question, simple and pure, caught Helen off guard. She blinked once, twice, as if coming back into herself. Then, with deliberate calm, she straightened her back. Her gaze flickered over to the mess on the floor and the shards of porcelain scattered like broken promises. "Yes," she said softly, "I just lost my appetite." The words hung in the air, colder than they should have been. Brooke glanced at her mother, but Yvette didn't look the least bit remorseful. Instead, Yvette's eyes glinted with something else. Triumph, maybe, or the satisfaction of having crossed a line so far that it couldn't be undone. Helen turned her gaze to the table, willing herself not to react, not to let the tears she could feel threatening to rise come to the surface. She wasn't going to break. Not here. Not for this. Liam, too, turned his eyes downward, but he didn't look away. Helen could feel his gaze, steady and true. He didn't need to say anything. She could see it in his eyes. He was on her side. Sean, already reaching for a serving spoon to pick at the rest of the food that hadn't hit the floor, didn't seem to notice how things had shifted in the room. His eyes were elsewhere, perhaps already focused on the next moment, already trying to move past the incident. But for Helen, this wasn't something she could just brush off. The plate wasn't just a plate. The food wasn't just food. It was everything. It was a line crossed, an insult too sharp to ignore. Her stomach tightened, and she realized then, without a doubt, this dinner had changed everything. The cost of this meal wasn't the food. No, it was something much heavier. But for now, she remained silent. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't yell. She would only wait. Wait for the right moment. And when it came, she'd make sure that Yvette, Brooke, and even Sean understood one thing. No one crossed her without consequences. The evening wasn't over yet. The house felt unusually quiet the next morning, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The scent of the roast beef and mashed potatoes was long gone, replaced by a faint, lingering smell of cleaning products from the spilled dinner. Helen stood in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at the mess in the dining room. The shards of glass were still there, scattered across the floor like jagged, broken truths. It was strange how something as simple as a meal could shatter in such a way, but in her mind, the metaphor was too obvious to ignore. She turned away from the scene and walked to the study, the familiar rhythm of her steps grounding her. She had work to do. Opening the filing cabinet with its faded green folders and brittle papers, Helen sifted through old documents. Her fingers brushed against stacks of bills, a few contracts, and then she found it. A folder labeled Lease Agreement Addendum in her careful script. It had been buried under a few other files, tucked away and forgotten. A lease addendum she'd drafted 2 years ago for Yvette and Brooke's stay in the house. The one that had never been signed. She had kept it in case they ever became permanent tenants, something she had reluctantly entertained once upon a time. But of course, they'd never agreed to the terms. It had never been official, and as a result, it remained an unfinished thought. Helen smiled to herself as she pulled it from the folder. The page was a little dog-eared, the edges faintly yellowed with age. She read through it again, her sharp eyes catching every clause, every term. The wording was precise, clear, firm, and unequivocal. She hadn't been naive enough to trust Yvette and Brooke on verbal promises alone. There was a time when she might have felt awkward about confronting them about this kind of thing. But now it was her weapon. She grabbed her pen and updated the document, filled in the clauses she'd left incomplete 2 years ago. Terms of tenancy, rent schedule, default clauses, and, of course, the all-important 15-day notice for eviction. She amended it with her signature at the bottom, feeling the weight of each word as she wrote it. When she was done, the document felt more like a declaration than a mere formality. As she set it aside, her eyes caught the stain on the carpet, still visible even in the bright morning light. It was like a scar, marking the moment when something irreversible had been done. A knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Frankie," she murmured under her breath, already knowing it was him. She went to the door and opened it to find her longtime friend standing there, his wide-brimmed hat tipped low over his graying hair, a warm smile on his face, despite the circumstances. "Morning, Helen," he said, stepping inside. His eyes immediately darted to the dining room, where the damage still lay in plain view. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice laced with both concern and curiosity. "It was a statement," she replied coolly, her gaze never leaving the papers on the desk. "A very clear one." Frankie stepped closer, his weathered eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the broken glass and the red stain on the carpet. He didn't need to ask who had caused it. He already knew. "You mean to tell me that was her idea of making a point?" he said, his tone edging with disbelief. Helen gave a small, tight-lipped smile. Both disrespect and declaration. She handed him the revised lease addendum, and he took it without hesitation. Frankie didn't need to ask about the specifics. He trusted her judgment without question. He unfolded the page, scanned it quickly, and nodded slowly. "You're not playing around," he said. "No," she replied firmly, her voice steady. "I'm filing by Friday. It'll be official." Frankie studied her face for a moment, his brow furrowing, but then he grinned, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes deepening. "I've seen you fight for a lot of things, Helen, but I never thought I'd see you fight like this." She met his gaze. "You don't cross a line like that in my house, not without consequences." Frankie let out a low whistle and folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket. "You're sure you want to go through with this?" "Absolutely," Helen replied. "It's time to show them I'm serious, and if they don't take me seriously now, they will when they see the papers." Just as the conversation seemed to settle, Liam appeared at the doorway, a piece of yellow sticky note in his hand. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet understanding that ran deeper than his 14 years. He didn't need to say much. He just handed the note to his grandmother. Helen read it aloud to herself. "You're the real homeowner." Her heart swelled, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. He was on her side. He understood. Frankie raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like someone's learned from the best." Helen placed the note on the table with a gentle sigh, feeling something she hadn't expected. Pride. It wasn't often she allowed herself to feel that, but Liam, her grandson, had just given her more confidence than she'd had in years. "Don't worry, Frankie," she said, her voice steady and sure. "This is only the beginning." The door clicked shut behind him as he left, the soft sound a mark of a decision made. And as Helen sat there, looking over the revised document, she knew that nothing would be the same again. She wasn't just setting boundaries anymore. She was redefining them, and she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The real fight was about to begin. The house was quieter now, the air thick with the tension that had settled in the wake of last night's dinner. Helen sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice spread out before her, her pen hovering over the final sentence. She could hear the sound of Sean's voice, muffled from the living room, but his words reached her easily. "Mom, she's just intense sometimes," Sean said, his tone flat, like he was trying to neutralize everything with a casualness that had always grated on her nerves. Helen didn't answer immediately. She focused on the pen in her hand, pushing it slowly across the paper as if the motion could ground her. She hadn't needed his defense in the first place. But Sean, ever the peacemaker, never quite understood the cost of letting things slide. She knew his heart was in the right place. He didn't want to cause waves, but in this house there were certain things you didn't ignore, things you didn't tolerate, things like disrespect. After a few beats, she finally spoke, her voice low and even. "So is a hurricane. Doesn't mean you leave the door open." She heard Sean's sigh from the other room. He didn't respond, and that was the problem. He never responded when it mattered most. Brooke's voice cut through the silence, approaching with her usual attempt at placation. "Helen, we—" "Stop," Helen interjected, her voice sharper than she intended. But she couldn't hold it back anymore. "I've had enough of this." She stood and walked into the living room where Sean and Brooke sat. Brooke had her hands folded neatly on her lap, her lips stretched into a tight smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. Sean was flipping through a magazine, looking anywhere but at his mother. Brooke caught her gaze. "I know this has been difficult, but Helen, we need to work through this as a family." Helen blinked, surprised at the audacity. Work through it. You want to work through what? You think I'm just going to pretend nothing happened? That's not how this works. Brooke stiffened but didn't back down. Yvette's upset. I'm asking her to stay a few more days so we can all calm down. Helen felt a strange sort of calm sweep over her at those words. Calm, cold, calculated. She had done enough calming down, enough accommodating, enough tiptoeing. Now it was time for them to learn a lesson. No, she said, her voice like ice. I'm done. Brooke blinked, caught off guard, but Helen didn't give her the chance to protest. She walked back to the kitchen and took the eviction notice from the table. It was official now. 3 names on it. Yvette, Brooke, Sean, everyone who had been complicit. Everyone who had allowed this to go on for far too long. The weight of it felt almost satisfying. She opened the drawer and pulled out a fresh folder, tucking the eviction notice into it. As she turned, the doorbell rang, cutting through the tension like a sudden gust of wind. Frankie. She knew it was him before she even saw him standing on the porch, his familiar face framed by the autumn sunlight. Morning. Helen? Frankie said, his voice rough with the kind of knowing that only a true friend could carry. You've got a lot on your plate today, huh? Helen nodded, walking toward the door. I'm making sure the plates are cleared. Frankie followed her inside, noticing the stack of papers on the table. He peered down at the eviction notice, then back at Helen with a raised eyebrow. You still sure about this? He asked, his voice low. Helen didn't hesitate. I'm sure. She handed him the papers. I need you to notarize this. It's going through by Friday. Frankie took the notice, examining it briefly before pulling out his notary stamp from his jacket pocket. You really want to go all the way with this, huh? No turning back now, she said, her voice steady but a touch harder than usual. He nodded, stamping the paper with a quiet thunk that made the room feel colder. Want me to serve it? Helen paused, the weight of the decision settling over her again. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the end of something. The end of tolerating disrespect. The end of turning the other cheek. It was the beginning of something much bigger. No, she said, meeting Frankie's eyes with a calm determination that sent a shiver down his spine. I'll deliver it with dinner. Frankie's eyebrows shot up in surprised amusement. Dinner? Helen smiled, but it wasn't a smile of humor. It was something darker, more deliberate. I think they'll understand it better that way. She watched Frankie's face soften into something resembling pride, or maybe respect. But it didn't last long. His smile faded as he leaned in and whispered, They won't know what hit them. Helen turned back to the eviction notice, running her fingers over the ink. She would serve them dinner. And for dessert, they'd get the consequences. Frankie's departure felt like the closing of a door on one chapter. As the sound of his boots faded down the porch steps, Helen turned back to the kitchen. She could feel it in the air. The shift. There was no going back. This wasn't just about getting rid of unwanted house guests. It was about reclaiming her home, her space, her authority. The next move was hers, and it would be the final one. The dining room was as pristine as always, the table set with careful precision. The polished silverware caught the low light of the chandelier, reflecting off the crystal glasses. The air was thick with the scent of the roast chicken. Seasoned perfectly and roasted to golden perfection. Mashed potatoes, still creamy, still warm, were piled high in their serving dish. No one would ever guess that just yesterday, that very table had borne the weight of a shattered dinner, the meal now replaced by the calm of the present. Helen moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, her hands steady as she arranged the dishes, the hum of the oven almost comforting. She didn't rush, though every part of her wanted to, Every part of her wanted to get this over with, but not yet. Not now. She'd learned long ago that some things, like power, were best served slowly. The doorbell rang. Again. Too loud, too sharp. Brooke, ever the eager peacemaker, answered it first, with a nervous glance at Helen. Yvette followed, her gait slow and deliberate, as if she were about to enter a battlefield and wanted to make sure she didn't step into the line of fire. They entered the room, all smiles and forced pleasantries, as though nothing at all had changed. Brooke, as expected, poured the wine first. Too much, perhaps. It was her attempt at easing the tension. Yvette, at her side, accepted her glass with a sharp laugh, the kind that grated on Helen's nerves. It was too much, too loud, too fake. "So, Helen," Yvette began, taking her seat with the grace of someone who knew she was the center of attention. "This chicken looks just divine. You've really outdone yourself this time." Helen didn't respond. She simply sat across from them, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Every movement was precise, controlled. She didn't need to respond to Yvette, not now. Not after everything. Yvette's voice cut through the air again, louder than necessary, aimed at something or someone, Helen, no doubt. "You know, I've always thought you were a bit too formal. Dinner should be about enjoying the moment. A little laughter, a little wine, a little less tension, don't you think?" Brooke laughed at that, too quickly, too loudly. The sound scraped against Helen's ears, but she let it pass. This was their show. Let them think it was all still fine. The evening dragged on like that. The clinking of silverware, the too bright laughter, the polite conversations that felt more and more distant. Sean was silent, looking between the two women, his eyes too focused on his plate. Helen felt the weight of his silence in a way that stung deeper than Yvette's words. She could feel his reluctance, his inability to stand up to anyone, least of all his mother. After dessert, Helen took a breath and stood. She moved with purpose, her steps measured as she reached for the thick envelope she had prepared earlier. It was heavy in her hand, the edges sharp, the weight of it thick and final. She turned to face Yvette. The room had quieted. The laughter had faded. "Since we're being honest now," Helen said, her voice soft, but it cut through the air like a razor. "Here's your notice." She placed the envelope carefully in front of Yvette. The woman froze, her glass of wine midair, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the envelope. There was no denying it now. She knew what it was, and the satisfaction that filled Helen's chest felt almost criminal. Yvette scoffed. It was the only thing she could do. Disdain was all she had left. "What's this?" she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've lost your mind, Helen." Sean, who had been quiet up until this point, finally looked up, his brow furrowed, his voice edged with confusion. "Mom, what is this?" Helen didn't flinch. She simply met Sean's eyes with a steady gaze. 15 days, she said, her voice as cool as the marble countertops that surrounded them. "Starting now. You're trespassing after that." The words hung in the air. Thick. Final. A death sentence for their stay in her home. Yvette's face contorted, her lips pulling tight in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You can't do this," she spat, standing up from the table. "You're just going to kick me out? After everything?" Helen didn't flinch. She just watched her stand, watched her make a scene. This wasn't about being nice anymore. It was about ending it. She'd given them chances. She'd been patient. But now, she was done. "You crossed the line," Helen said, her voice colder than she ever expected it to sound. "I don't care how loud you yell or how hard you try to spin this. It's over." Yvette's lips tightened, but she didn't speak. She knew there was nothing left to say. Sean glanced from Yvette to his mother, the conflict written all over his face, but he didn't move. His silence, once again, spoke louder than anything. And then, Helen turned to leave. No more words. No more explanations. She didn't owe them that. The door closed behind her, and in the silence that followed, it became clear. The power had shifted. Yvette's next move would be her own, but the game had changed. And this time, Helen had made sure the last word would be hers. The courthouse loomed in front of them, its cold stone facade a fitting backdrop for the storm brewing inside Helen's chest. The air outside was crisp, but the weight of what was about to happen settled over her like a heavy blanket. Frankie walked beside her, his gait steady, but even he seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. His hand, once so sure with a notary stamp, now rested in his coat pocket as they crossed the threshold together. "Ready?" he asked, though the question hung in the air more as an observation than a real query. He already knew the answer. Helen didn't need to say anything. The small stack of papers in her hand was all the answer anyone needed. She nodded once, the movement small but deliberate, and without another word, she approached the counter. The clerk behind it, an older woman with wire-rimmed glasses, glanced up as they arrived. Her fingers tapped lightly on the keyboard, waiting for a greeting. "I'm here to file for eviction," Helen said, her voice calm and unwavering. There was no hesitation, no trace of uncertainty. The clerk raised an eyebrow, but quickly processed the form, accepting the papers with a nod. "Is this under a lease agreement?" she asked, eyes scanning the document. Helen gave a curt nod. "It's a residential primary residence clause. You'll find it all in there." The clerk's hands paused over the documents, a momentary flicker of acknowledgement passing across her face. She stamped the papers with an official sound that felt oddly final in the quiet of the office. Case opened. Residential. Primary residence clause. Helen stared at the stamp, the black ink imprinted into the paper like a permanent mark, sealing her decision, her resolve. The case was now official. There was no going back. Frankie gave a low whistle beside her. "I always forget how real it feels when they stamp it. You know, when it's all official." Helen didn't respond. She didn't need to. The weight of the moment hung thickly between them. Once the paperwork was filed, she turned to Frankie with a steady look. "Let's update the homeowner's insurance," she said quietly, already walking out of the courthouse and back toward her car. Frankie followed, his pace slightly faster, as though the air outside were suddenly too tight to hold both of them. By the time they were back at Helen's house, the first thing she did was dial the insurance company. She wasn't just protecting her property anymore. She was fortifying her stance. The policy needed to reflect hostile co-tenancy. If she was going to win this fight, she had to make sure every inch of her defenses was reinforced. "Changes have been made," the agent confirmed when she got off the phone. "We've updated the terms, and you should receive confirmation in the next 24 hours. "Good," Helen muttered, more to herself than anyone else. She walked into the kitchen, moving toward the window that looked out over the cul-de-sac. The world outside was so quiet, so still. And yet, she knew. Things were about to explode. She could feel it in the air. She had drawn a line, and now the only question was how far they were willing to go to cross it. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a Facebook notification. Brooke. Her post was as expected. "Some people choose war over healing." Helen smirked at the screen, her fingers drumming the table. There it was, the passive-aggressive swipe. The attempt to twist this into some kind of battle where she would be the villain. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could easily respond. She could easily tear the words apart with a single well-placed comment. But instead, she locked her phone and put it aside. She wouldn't play into it. Instead, she turned to Liam, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, eyes glued to a book, though Helen could tell he was paying close attention. He was always paying attention. "You know they'll try to spin it, right?" he asked, not looking up from his book. Helen smiled, her lips curling in a way that was both proud and deadly calm. "They can spin all they want," she said, her voice steady, with the kind of assurance that made the air feel heavier. "I own the table, and right now, they don't even have a seat at it." Liam glanced up, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good one, Grandma." Helen chuckled softly, the sound light in the silence. Her grandson always knew how to lighten the mood, even when everything else felt like it was teetering on the edge. But she wasn't laughing because it was funny. She was laughing because for the first time in a long time, she felt in control. The battle wasn't about words or emotions anymore. It wasn't about trying to fix things or smooth over every rough edge. No, this was about consequences. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting on the arms, feeling the coolness of the wood beneath her palms. There was no going back from this. The game had begun, and now, she was in charge of the rules. The phone buzzed again. Another notification. This time, it was a text from Frankie. "You're in the driver's seat now. Let's see how far they'll go to test you." Helen looked at the message for a long time before typing a simple response. "They won't." And then, as the days stretched into evening, she realized this wasn't just about eviction papers. This was about her reclaiming her space, her home, and everything she had built. The world was shifting, and the table she had set for dinner, everything about that moment, had been only a taste of what was coming. The real fight was just beginning. And for the first time in years, Helen was ready to face it head-on. The knock on the door came when the house was quiet again. Helen had been standing in the kitchen, staring out the window, her fingers curled around a cold cup of coffee that had long lost its warmth. She had seen the way Brooke's post had unfolded on social media, how the subtle jabs were meant to paint her as unreasonable, as the villain of a drama she didn't care to participate in. Yet, deep down, Helen felt a cold sense of satisfaction that she had already won the battle. The war, however, was still to come. When the knock came again, Helen knew exactly who it was. She didn't rush to the door. Instead, she set the coffee down with deliberate slowness, her movements precise. She didn't need to look. She could already feel the energy outside her door. The guilt, the desperation. They weren't coming with apologies. They were coming with excuses. She opened the door without a word, her face a mask of calm. Brooke stood there, her face carefully composed, but Helen could see the edges of anxiety in her tightly pursed lips, in the stiff way she held herself. Yvette, standing behind her, looked every bit the storm that had torn through their house the other night, defiant, with a faint sneer playing at her lips. They had come, it seemed, to do what they did best: spin the situation. Brooke didn't speak right away. She just handed Helen the letter. Helen took it without a word. She already knew what was inside. The smooth, corporate style of Brooke's handwriting was as familiar to her as the flick of a switchblade, always hiding more than it revealed. As the door clicked shut behind them, Helen slid the envelope open and began to read. It was exactly what she'd expected, a mixture of victimhood and blame, cloaked in the false politeness of family. The words spilled out onto the page in a nauseating stream. "We're family, Helen. This is an overreaction. You've embarrassed us. This whole situation is unnecessary. It was just a dinner, a mistake. Please reconsider and allow us a little more time to process. We need more time. We beg you to give us one more week, just until after New Year's. After that, we will make plans to leave, but this is too much. Too soon." Helen's jaw tightened as she read. The letter was full of gaslighting, twisting reality to paint her as the irrational one, the one who had made everything worse. She could already see the guilt trip playing out. The plea to soften, to bend, the audacity of it. They wanted more time, but their time had already expired. Brooke's words on the page were nothing more than a mask for manipulation. It was clear as day. This wasn't an apology. This was an attempt to rewrite history, to make Helen feel like she was the one at fault. With a deep breath, Helen took a red pen from her desk drawer and began to mark up the letter. Each word of their supposed plea was crossed out with sharp, deliberate strokes. "We're family," she scrawled across the top in bold, angry letters. "This is an overreaction." She crossed off next, feeling the pen bite through the paper with a satisfying intensity. By the time she reached the end, the letter was a mess of red. She placed the pen down slowly and stared at the mess in front of her. "This is not an apology. This is manipulation," she muttered under her breath, running her hand over her forehead. She felt a presence behind her. Frankie, standing in the doorway, watching her quietly. He didn't need to ask. He could already see the change in her posture, the unshakable resolve now taking root. "You want me to respond legally?" Frankie asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much of this kind of thing in his years as a sheriff. Helen let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the paper as she considered it. No, she didn't want to engage with them on their level anymore. She had already taken legal action. There was no need to return to the battlefield with words that meant nothing. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I already did when I paid the filing fee." Frankie nodded slowly, his lips curling into the slightest grin. "Guess that's one way to shut it down." Helen stood up and looked at the letter one last time. It was done. No more games. No more waiting for their permission. She had made her move, and there was no taking it back. She walked to the kitchen window again, looking out at the same cul-de-sac. But now, the view was different. It wasn't just her home anymore. It was a fortress she'd built and fortified, stone by stone, and now the walls were high enough that no one could tear them down without facing the consequences. The front door opened again, this time quieter. Sean had returned. He had been outside, probably watching from the other side of the house, keeping his distance. Helen didn't turn to face him, but she could feel his presence behind her. She knew he was standing there, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. "I'm filing the papers," she said, without turning around, her voice steady, but cold. "It's done, Sean." He said nothing, and that silence spoke volumes. It wasn't the anger that hurt, but the quiet, the absence of any defense, any attempt to understand. He had already chosen his side, and it wasn't hers. The weight of the letter, the weight of the decision, felt like a 100-pound anchor lifting off her chest. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to hold it all together. She was just letting go, letting the pieces fall where they may. And when they did, she would make sure they were the ones left picking them up. The morning after, the quiet was different. Helen stood in front of the guest entry, her hand resting lightly on the cool metal of the doorframe, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. She wasn't just changing the locks, she was changing everything. She had ordered the smart lock the moment she'd left the courthouse the day before. It was installed now, sleek and modern, the kind of thing that should have been there all along. No more rusty keys, no more paper slips lost in a drawer. This was the future. Secure, reliable, final. The click of the door latch was solid. Final. Just like the decisions she'd made. She stepped back, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the lock one last time. This was her home. Only those she allowed would pass through these doors now. The sharp knock at the door came a few hours later. Yvette. Helen felt the stirrings of anger rise in her chest but didn't let it show. She didn't even rush to the door. There was no need. Yvette had lost the right to demand anything from her. Helen opened the door with a slow deliberation. Yvette stood there, her eyes wild, her hair frizzing out around her face like a halo of chaos. Her hands were clasped in front of her whole posture wound tight, as though the tension of the last few days was about to snap her in half. "My things are still in there," Yvette snapped, pointing toward the guest room. The words were rushed, frantic, like she couldn't quite catch her breath. "You can't just lock me out." Helen took a breath. The anger was there, just under the surface. But she didn't let it take hold. Instead, she let the quiet fall between them, letting Yvette feel the weight of it, letting her feel the absence of any sympathy. "They'll be boxed and on the porch by noon," Helen said, her voice cool and measured, every word a dagger wrapped in civility. Yvette's eyes flared, but she didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue. The door shut with a soft thud, the lock clicking in place. The scene outside, the one where she used to feel guilty, used to bend, was over. Helen turned to find Liam standing in the hallway, his quiet presence a comfort. He was still young, but in moments like these, she saw the growing strength in him. He didn't need to speak. He was already moving to help her gather Yvette's things. They worked in silence. Liam was precise, methodical, his movements sure as he stacked boxes. Helen handed him items, but her mind was elsewhere. The house felt colder now, emptier somehow. It wasn't just the things being packed away, it was the weight of what had been taken from her. Her trust, her peace, her patience. They had all been ripped away in an instant, and now she was reclaiming what was hers. As they worked, the house felt like it was folding in on itself. The clutter of their lives, their presence, was being packed up in an orderly way. Every item, every gesture, a reminder that this had to happen. Just as Liam was taping the final box shut, there was another knock on the door. Helen straightened, the instinct to retreat into her fortress taking hold again. She walked to the door, opening it this time without hesitation, knowing that it wasn't Yvette returning. Marla was standing there, her hands full with a bundle of something. Enough papers to make Helen's heart quicken. "Brought these by," Marla said, her voice low but carrying a weight of understanding. "Security cameras, just in case they come back after curfew." Helen accepted them without a word, her fingers brushing against the cool plastic of the camera packages. Marla was always there for her, a quiet protector in her own right. "Thanks," Helen said, her voice steady, grateful for the support. Marla gave her a knowing smile. "I've been through this kind of thing before," she said with a sigh. "They'll try to test you. Just make sure you're ready for it." Helen nodded, and as Marla turned to leave, she couldn't help but feel the comforting weight of the cameras in her hands. It wasn't just about keeping them out, it was about keeping herself safe. When the door closed behind Marla, Helen walked back to the living room, where Liam had already started stacking the boxes of Yvette's things near the door. "I'll make sure everything is packed and moved to the porch by noon," she said, her voice hardening. "No more delays, no more chances. It's done." Liam didn't need to respond. He simply nodded, and Helen felt a flicker of something inside her. Pride, maybe, or something else. Perhaps it was strength. Strength in knowing she had control over her own space again. She glanced toward the guest room, imagining the look on Yvette's face when she saw the packed boxes, the emptiness, the finality. There was something about that image, about what it represented, that gave her a sense of peace. This was her home, and she wasn't going to let anyone, no matter who they were, take it from her. As the minutes ticked by, Helen's phone buzzed. Another notification, another passive-aggressive post, probably from Brooke. But this time, she didn't even look. The house was silent now, the air still, and she could almost hear the echo of her own voice. Steady, unwavering. This was it. They were gone, and she was finally free. The last thing Helen did was write a note on one of the boxes. She didn't know if Yvette would read it, or even if she'd care. but the words seemed important to her. "Careful," she wrote. "That dishware breaks like manners." She taped the note to the box and took a deep breath. This battle was over. And for once, Helen knew exactly who had won. Helen's phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts as she carefully arranged the final box of Yvette's belongings by the door. The house had fallen into a strange quiet, too quiet, almost like a deep breath before something heavy and inevitable happened. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and for a moment she hesitated. When she finally read the message, she didn't react immediately. It was from Sean. "I don't think this is going to work. I can't keep doing this, Mom." The words felt like ice water, cold and thick, making it hard to breathe. Her son, her only son, the boy she had raised. She blinked at the screen for a moment, her thoughts suddenly a swirling mess of disbelief, anger, and pain. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she set the phone down slowly on the kitchen counter, her face perfectly still. She had expected the guilt trip, the manipulation. She had prepared herself for Brooke's passive-aggressive tone and Yvette's fiery demands. But Sean? She hadn't expected this from him. Not her son. Her mind drifted back, unexpectedly, to a day when he was 13. It was a parent-teacher conference, one of those awkward, rushed meetings where parents tried their best to pretend they understood everything their child was going through. The school hallways smelled of old books and fresh markers, and Helen had sat there, beside Sean, waiting for the inevitable discussions of grades, behavior, and classroom interactions. But what stuck with her most wasn't the talk about his work ethic or his grades. It was the way he'd defended her. "You can't just say that about my mom," Sean had said, his voice clear and firm. She'd been surprised by the forcefulness in his words when he'd stood up to one of his teachers over something trivial, but it had meant everything to her. That was the boy she knew, the one who would stand tall, defend her, and face any challenge head-on. It wasn't until years later, after his marriage, that she began to see the cracks in him. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, his back began to bend, his voice a little quieter. And now, this text. She could almost hear his voice in it, trying to placate, trying to put everything back in a neat little box for everyone as he always did. "I can't keep doing this, Mom." She wasn't sure what hurt more, the words or the fact that she hadn't seen this coming. Her son, complicit in the silence, too scared to make a choice, had slowly morphed into someone who couldn't even stand up for himself, let alone for her. The house was still. It was a silence she wasn't used to. The pounding of her heartbeat in her ears was louder than the hum of the refrigerator, louder than the sound of her own breath. It was a raw kind of pain, one she hadn't felt in years. And then, on impulse, she reached for the pen and paper on the desk. Helen's hand moved smoothly, her pen flying across the page, the words coming with an ease that surprised her. It was a letter to Sean, but it wasn't an apology or a plea. "I still care, but I won't be disrespected in my own home." The words burned as she wrote them, but she didn't stop. She felt the weight of them settling inside her like a stone. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside, her eyes lingering on it for a long moment. It wasn't an ultimatum. It wasn't a threat. It was the truth. As simple and as cutting as that. It was everything she'd wanted to say for a long time. Helen stood and walked toward the living room, a deep sigh escaping her lips as she gazed out the window at the stillness of the street. Her mind flickered briefly to Liam, who had quietly, without words, been her rock throughout all of this. Unlike Sean, he wasn't afraid to face the truth, no matter how hard it was. She thought she'd made peace with the situation, but there was something inside her that wasn't quite finished, that wasn't ready to move forward yet. Maybe it was the unresolved hurt. Maybe it was the fact that Sean had not been the son she thought she knew. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She turned, unsure of who it was this time. The door creaked as she opened it, and Liam stood there, holding a crumpled piece of paper. He didn't say anything, just handed it to her. It was the letter. The one she had written to Sean. Her eyes narrowed and she realized, suddenly, that it had been intercepted. Brooke found it first, Liam said softly, his voice steady but laced with understanding. I think she was hoping you wouldn't send it. Helen didn't speak at first. She held the letter in her hands, the truth of it still burning through her fingertips. Mom, Liam said after a long moment, looking up at her with those wise eyes. I think Dad's scared of her, not you. She looked down at her son, her heart aching in ways she didn't know it could. He was right. But it wasn't just fear. It was weakness. And that was what hurt the most. With a quiet, sad smile, Helen folded the letter again and tucked it into her pocket. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, she felt a strange sort of relief, because even if Sean couldn't see it yet, she had finally drawn the line. And she wasn't going to let anyone, no one, cross it again. As the door clicked shut behind Liam, Helen stood there, feeling the weight of everything finally start to lift. The battle for her home, her peace, was far from over. But she would face it head-on, just as she always had. And this time, no one would be able to take anything from her again. Helen sat in the sleek, polished office of her attorney, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above almost too sharp against the stillness of the room. She hadn't been to a lawyer's office in years, not since she'd handled the final affairs of her late husband. But today, everything felt different. It felt necessary. The attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 50s named Karen, sat across from her, looking at the stack of documents that Helen had brought with her. There was no need to explain further. The decision had already been made, and now the legal framework for it had to be put in place. Are you sure about this, Helen? Karen asked, her tone measured but concerned. Changing the will at this point, it's a major shift. Helen nodded, her hands folded in front of her, a sense of finality in her posture. I'm sure. She could see the hesitation in Karen's eyes, the same hesitation she'd seen in her son's face just days ago. It was the same reluctance to face reality, to make a definitive choice when it could hurt. But Helen had crossed that threshold long ago. There was no turning back. Her eyes flickered down to the will she'd signed years ago, the one that had divided her estate equally among Sean, Brooke, and Liam. But that had been before everything had changed, before Sean had pulled away, before the house had become a battleground. And now, it was time to make sure that the people who had shown her nothing but disrespect were no longer entitled to a thing. I want Sean and Brooke temporarily written out, Helen said, her voice firm. The estate should go into a trust for Liam. He's the only one who hasn't betrayed me. He's the only one who understands what family means. Karen's pen hovered above the paper. Are you certain this is what you want, Helen? This could cause problems if anyone ever decides to challenge it. Helen's gaze didn't waver. Let them challenge it. I've already seen what happens when I bend. There will be no more bending. The lawyer seemed to weigh her words before nodding, but she didn't press further. They both knew it was done. There was another item Helen had added in the final stages of her thinking. She leaned forward, her voice growing colder as she spoke. I also want Yvette barred from all access points. No legal or medical access to any part of my life. If she tries to interfere, it needs to be clear. There are no second chances. Karen wrote that down without question. Understood, she said. Any further clauses? Helen was quiet for a moment, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. Then, with a chilling calm, she added, Yes. If anyone makes a future threat, if anyone crosses a line like this again, it will void all inheritance, permanently. The words hung in the air between them, and Helen let them settle. It wasn't just about money, it was about power, about reclaiming what had been taken from her. The people who had broken her trust, who had treated her like a doormat, would not benefit from the things she'd built. They would not have any claim to her life, her legacy, or her peace. She sat back in the chair, a strange, satisfied feeling settling in her chest. This was the last move, the final gesture of control. The last thing to sever the ties to those who didn't deserve her loyalty. Karen gathered the papers and began to make the necessary adjustments, drafting the revisions as she went. Helen's mind wandered, as it often did in moments of clarity. She thought about Liam, his steady presence in the house, how different he was from his father, how different he was from the son she'd raised. He was the one she could count on, the one who had never wavered, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The lawyer finished drafting the documents and handed them over for Helen to review. As she looked over the final version, the weight of her decisions began to lift, but the gravity of it all was still present. She placed the updated will into a folder, carefully labeling it, "New Year, New Boundaries." "Everything's in order," Karen said, looking over the documents one last time. "It's legally binding now." Helen stood and nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "Good. Make sure it's filed by the end of the day." As they shook hands and Helen made her way to the door, Karen paused. "You've made some tough choices today, Helen, but they were yours to make. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Helen met her gaze. "I won't." When she stepped out into the cool air of the late afternoon, the weight of it all settled over her like a soft fog. The decision was final, and it was hers. The power was hers. The control had returned to her hands, and nothing, no one, would take that away again. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed once more. She checked it without hesitation. Frankie's name flashed on the screen. "This is more thorough than my divorce decree," the text read, with a small laughing emoji at the end. Helen smiled, but there was no humor in it. She typed back, "You should see what happens when they push too far." She hit send, then pocketed the phone. The last chapter was written, but the story was far from over. And Helen knew, for the first time in years, she was in control. The courtroom was a sterile, uncomfortable place, the kind of room where every decision felt heavy and final. Helen sat in the back row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the edges of her fingers pale from the pressure. She'd expected this, expected the challenge, but the reality of it, sitting here now, made the fight feel more real than ever. Brooke and Yvette were seated on the opposite side, their faces set in that familiar, practiced mask of outrage and indignation. They had filed their contest to the eviction, claiming that it was retaliatory and emotionally abusive, accusations that felt as hollow as they were predictable. Helen could almost hear Brooke's voice in her mind, the same tone she'd used in her Facebook post, the same rehearsed victimhood. The judge, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a pair of glasses perched precariously on his nose, glanced up from the paperwork in front of him. His expression was unreadable. The kind of face that had seen hundreds of these cases, but never quite one like this. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of papers and the faint clicking of the clock on the wall. Brooke stood up first, her posture rigid, her voice clear and accusing as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, we are not here to fight for property or money. We're here because this eviction was a personal vendetta. My mother and I were forced out of the home we had every right to stay in, and we've been treated with nothing but cruelty. This is about power and control, not boundaries." Helen's heart tightened, but she didn't flinch. This was the game they were playing now. They would twist the truth, manipulate the narrative, but it was too late. She was done letting them have the upper hand. When it was her turn to speak, Helen stood slowly, her back straight, her voice calm as it filled the room. She didn't need to raise it, didn't need to shout over the accusations. Instead, she presented the truth. Facts that couldn't be twisted or manipulated. She handed over her packet of evidence, placing it carefully on the table for the judge to review. "I'm not here to play games or fight about power," she said, her tone measured but firm. "I'm here to protect what's mine. The eviction is based on a series of events, repeated incidents of disrespect and threats that crossed a line. This is not retaliation. This is me drawing a line in the sand." She watched as the judge flipped through the papers, his expression unchanged. There were receipts from the store, the police report from the night Yvette slapped the plate out of her hands, and text logs, messages where Brooke had attempted to gaslight her, pushing her to forgive, to forget. The judge's gaze flicked over the documents, his eyes pausing briefly on the police report. Helen saw his brow furrow, the weight of what had transpired finally sinking in. There were no more words, no more accusations. The facts were there in black and white. Brooke was already shaking her head, her lips pulled tight in frustration. "This is not about boundaries, Helen," she spat, her voice cutting through the silence. "This is about power. You're punishing us because you can." Helen's heart didn't race, didn't skip a beat. She had heard it all before. Brooke's words were empty, and the judge could see that. She had nothing left to manipulate with, only the truth, and that was all Helen needed. Helen's voice was steady, her gaze unwavering as she replied, "No, it's about boundaries. It's about respect. Something I was never shown, despite everything I've done for this family." There was a long pause. The judge didn't speak, didn't look up, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk as he considered everything laid before him. The room was still, the silence stretching long enough that even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Finally, the judge nodded, a small but decisive gesture. "The eviction stands. The court finds that there is sufficient cause for the removal, effective immediately." The words hit the air with a finality that sent a ripple of relief through Helen's chest, though she didn't let it show. She hadn't expected the judge to rule in any other way, but hearing it aloud, hearing that it was official, felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had fought for her peace, and she had won. Brooke's face was a storm of emotion as she sat back down, her hand gripping the arm of the chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Yvette beside her was seething, but there was nothing they could do. The court had spoken. There would be no more games. Helen gathered her things, her movements deliberate and calm, but her heart was lighter than it had been in months. She didn't need to say anything more, no more explanations, no more justifications. The truth had been heard. As she made her way out of the courtroom, Liam was waiting for her in the hallway, his face set with quiet pride. He didn't speak immediately, but when he wrapped his arms around her in a hug, it said everything she needed to hear. "I'm glad someone tells the truth," he whispered into her ear, his voice steady, unwavering. Helen pulled back slightly, looking down at him. The weight of the world seemed to lift from her chest in that moment, and she could finally breathe. This battle, this long, exhausting fight, had ended. But in the quiet strength of her grandson, in the truth that now lay in the open, she found something even greater than victory. She found peace. And for the first time in a long while, she knew she had done the right thing. The sun had barely started to set as Helen sat at the kitchen table, the evening light casting long shadows across the room. The remnants of the dinner fiasco, shattered glass, spilled roast, and broken dreams, seemed like a lifetime ago, but the weight of it still lingered. She glanced down at the receipts and invoices she had painstakingly put together, the cold reality of the damage settling in. She was thorough. Nothing would be left to chance. If they wanted to play the game of consequence, then they would learn the cost of their actions. Helen meticulously calculated each line: the ruined meal, the broken plate, the professional cleaning of the carpet. It wasn't about the money, it was about making sure they understood what their actions had cost. In total, it came to 492.33. It wasn't a small sum, but it was a fair price for the disrespect they'd shown her. She typed up the invoice with clinical precision, making sure every detail was listed. As she finished, she hesitated for a moment, then hit send. The words on the invoice were simple, unambiguous. Payment due within 15 days. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Helen leaned back in her chair, a small, satisfied smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't just about the money, it was about teaching them a lesson they would never forget. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. She knew who it was before she even looked. Sean. The message was brief, terse. Seriously? Helen paused, considering the reply. For a moment, she wanted to explain herself, to justify her actions, but she knew better. She had already said everything she needed to say. With a steady hand, she typed back. Seriously. A slight chuckle escaped her as she set the phone down. She could practically hear the frustration in Sean's voice, the disbelief at how far she had gone. But in her heart, she knew she was right. This wasn't about power. It was about setting boundaries, about reclaiming control. And now, the consequences were there in black and white. No more bending, no more letting them walk all over her. Just then, the doorbell rang. It was a sound that had become oddly familiar lately, but this time there was no urgency in Helen's step. She didn't rush to the door. She walked slowly, deliberately, as if the world had slowed down to match her pace. Marla was standing there when she opened the door, her usual warm smile greeting Helen. She held a tray of muffins in her hands, and as usual, her purse was slung casually over her shoulder, ready for anything. "You're a glutton for punishment," Helen said with a smile, letting Marla in. Marla winked, unfazed. "I figured you could use a little company, and these," she gestured to the tray, "are just the thing for a little post-court celebration. Plus, I've got a bit of gossip from the courthouse." Helen raised an eyebrow as they both sat down at the kitchen table. Marla placed the muffins in front of her with a flourish, and they both dug in. The familiar warmth of the kitchen, the comforting scent of freshly baked goods, felt like a world away from the courtroom and the mess of the last few weeks. But underneath it all, the tension remained, simmering just beneath the surface. "So," Helen said after taking a bite, "what's the scoop?" Marla chuckled, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, you're not going to believe this. I heard from someone at the courthouse today that Brooke was already talking about moving on and leaving it behind, but of course, you know what she's like. All that talk about peace and forgiveness is just for show." Helen nodded, knowing exactly what Marla meant. "She's playing the long game, hoping I'll back down. It's not going to happen." Marla gave her a knowing smile. "Exactly. She expected to hit you and then eat your pie. You gave her paperwork instead." Helen chuckled, the humor light but with an edge. "Dessert comes last, and so did my patience." Marla raised her mug in a small, playful toast. "To your patience, then. And to the fact that you didn't let them get away with it." Helen clinked her mug against Marla's, feeling a flicker of satisfaction that felt long overdue. The sense of control, of finality, was finally settling in. She had done it. She had set the boundaries, and now they had to live with the consequences. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't need to check. It was another message from Sean, probably more frustration, more accusations. But this time, she didn't feel the need to answer. She knew that whatever he said, whatever Brooke or Yvette said, it didn't matter anymore. Helen felt the weight of the day shift. There was no going back, no more accommodating, no more second-guessing herself. The fight had been long, but it was hers now. and this time, she wasn't going to back down. As the evening stretched on, the house settled back into a quiet that felt like a new beginning. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but Helen was ready. She was stronger than she had ever been, and whatever came next, she would face it head on. And when the dust finally settled, she knew there would be nothing left but peace, the kind she had earned. Christmas morning arrived, blanketing the world outside in a quiet, still serenity. The snow, fine and powdery, dusted the front yard in soft strokes, the kind that made everything feel new again. Inside, the house was calm, the familiar warmth of the fireplace a stark contrast to the chill that lingered just outside the windows. Helen stood in the kitchen, a cup of cocoa in her hands, the steam rising lazily into the air. She had no interest in the holiday fanfare, no need for it this year. There would be no guests, no forced smiles. It had been a peaceful few weeks since the court ruling, since the weight of the eviction had been lifted from her shoulders. She had set her boundaries and was finally beginning to feel the quiet of her home settling in around her. She didn't need them, didn't need their apologies or their empty gestures, but the peace was short-lived. The doorbell rang sharply, cutting through the stillness like a jolt of electricity. Helen stood perfectly still for a moment, the cocoa cup held loosely in her hands. She already knew who it was. There was no mistaking that familiar ring, that urgent, uninvited presence. She didn't rush to the door. The sound echoed again, followed by a rapid knock that she could feel in her bones. Yvette and Brooke, they were here. Helen took a long sip of her cocoa, savoring the warmth before she set the cup down on the counter. She wasn't surprised. She had expected this. Christmas, for them, was the perfect time to re-enter her life. They would arrive with gifts, with smiles, with hollow apologies masked by a sheen of goodwill. They wanted to force their way back in, to claim some semblance of normalcy, to pretend that the world hadn't shifted beneath them. But it had. And Helen wasn't about to let them pretend otherwise. She walked to the front window, pulling aside the curtain just enough to see them standing on her porch. Yvette, arms full of what appeared to be wrapped gifts, stood a little too proudly, her lips set in a tight, practiced smile. Brooke hovered slightly behind her, the faintest trace of uncertainty in her posture, as though she could already sense that things weren't going to go the way she expected. Helen exhaled slowly and then moved to the phone. She didn't open the door. There would be no sweet talk, no false pleasantries. She didn't have the time for that anymore. Instead, she dialed the local non-emergency line, her fingers steady despite the rising tension in her chest. The operator answered after a few rings, her voice polite but distant. "I'd like to file a trespassing report," Helen said, her tone even. "I have a history with these individuals, and they are on my property uninvited." There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of keyboard clicks as the operator gathered the details. "Can you please provide your name and address, ma'am?" Helen gave the information without hesitation, then added, "This is a continuation of prior incidents involving my daughter-in-law and her mother. They've been served an eviction notice, and they are not welcome here." The operator assured her that a report would be filed and that a deputy would be dispatched shortly to ensure that no laws were being broken. Helen hung up, feeling the faintest thread of satisfaction in knowing she had taken the necessary steps to protect her peace. Outside, the doorbell rang again. The sound was insistent, impatient. Yvette's voice rose in protest, louder now, but Helen couldn't hear the words. Just the pitch of anger growing sharper. She turned away from the door and walked back to the kitchen, where she found Liam sitting at the table, quietly sipping his cocoa. He hadn't said much since the eviction had been finalized, but she knew he understood. There were no words needed. He just gave her a quiet smile, his eyes knowing. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Helen nodded. "I'm fine. Just handling it." Another knock, this one more forceful. Helen's calmness was unwavering. She wasn't going to be intimidated, not now, not ever again. Then, just as she was about to turn away from the door, the sound of another knock reached her ears. Softer, almost apologetic. Helen froze for a moment, then moved toward the door, peeking once again through the curtain. To her surprise, it wasn't Brooke and Yvette standing there. It was Sean. His face was pale, his posture defeated, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets like he didn't know what to do with them. He was standing next to the car, but he didn't look up, didn't meet her eyes. Helen felt a pang in her chest, but it was fleeting. He hadn't come here to apologize. He had come here because he had nowhere else to go, and perhaps, she hoped, he was starting to see the truth of it all. But that didn't mean she would let him in so easily. She took a deep breath, then turned away from the window. There was no need to answer. Not today. A car door slammed outside, the sound abrupt and jarring. Helen looked back, and in that moment, Marla's familiar face appeared, her steps brisk as she approached the front door. As always, Marla carried the quiet confidence of someone who wasn't afraid to face anything or anyone. "Just in case they come back after curfew," Marla said with a wink, pulling a .38 from her purse and tucking it neatly into the waistband of her coat. Helen's lips curved into a small smile. "You always know what to bring." Marla shrugged, unbothered. Sometimes. People need a little extra incentive to respect boundaries. Helen didn't need to ask if she had everything in hand. Marla had always been reliable, always ready to stand her ground, and today was no different. They both turned back toward the window as Sean slid into the driver's seat of his car, the engine roaring to life with a low, angry growl. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the quiet of the street once again intact. Helen stood in the moment of stillness, feeling the weight of her decisions and the power of her resolve. They had tried to break her. They had tried to force their way back in. But she had held firm. The door was locked, and the boundaries were hers to protect. The battle wasn't over. But Helen knew, no matter how much they tried to push, she had won. The courthouse felt different today. Less sterile, less cold than before. Perhaps it was the finality of everything that made it seem softer, or maybe it was the sense of control that came with having taken the first step to truly protect herself. Helen walked into the courtroom with a purpose, her back straight, her mind steady. She had fought for her peace, and now the court was going to give her the space to keep it. Today, she wasn't just asking for an eviction. Today, she was demanding respect, protection from the people who had pushed her too far. The judge was different today, too. His usual stern face now tinged with something that bordered on sympathy as he looked over the case. Yvette's actions had left no room for doubt, and the evidence, her history of threats, the plate-slapping incident, the emotional and physical toll of the past few months, spoke louder than words ever could. Helen sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, and waited as the judge reviewed the motions. Beside her, Frankie leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but keenly aware of what was at stake. This wasn't just a matter of legalities anymore. It was about her safety, her right to feel safe in her own home. The judge finally cleared his throat, lifting his gaze from the papers. "The court has reviewed the motion for a restraining order, and after careful consideration, I am granting a 12-month restraining order against Ms. Yvette Sterling. She is to have no contact with the petitioner, Helen Carter, during this period." Helen's breath caught in her throat, a weight lifting off her chest. The words echoed in the air, filling the space with a kind of finality that had been absent from her life for far too long. Yvette was to stay away. And that meant she could breathe again. The judge continued, his voice steady but clear. "In addition, Ms. Brooke Carter is restricted to driveway contact only. She will have no access to the property without prior notice and explicit permission from the petitioner. Any further violation of these terms will result in legal consequences. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a brief moment, Helen thought she heard Yvette shift in her seat. But when she looked, she saw only the tense lines of Brooke's jaw, her face tight with frustration. Brooke opened her mouth, but the judge cut her off with a single glance. "The ruling stands," he said simply, his gavel coming down with a definitive thunk. "This matter is concluded." Helen exhaled slowly. She wasn't celebrating. She didn't need to. But there was something freeing in hearing those words, something in the power of the finality they carried. This wasn't just a victory. It was a promise she'd made to herself, and it had been upheld. Outside the courthouse, as she walked toward her car, Helen could feel a shift in the air, a kind of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Nothing ever was when it came to family. But today, she had been heard, and she had been protected. That was all that mattered. Liam was waiting for her in the car, his face calm, though she could see the pride in his eyes. He didn't speak immediately, but when she slid into the passenger seat, he gave her a quiet nod. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," he said softly, his voice steady as always. Helen smiled at him, feeling something deep and unspoken settle between them. "Thanks, Liam, we're going to be okay." As the car pulled away from the courthouse, Helen's thoughts turned to the next step, making sure the boundaries were solid. She was going to make sure that Yvette and Brooke could never break in again, even if only by force of will. It wasn't just about avoiding them anymore. It was about ensuring that the safety she had fought so hard for would be hers to keep. By the time they got home, Helen was already planning. She walked straight to the home improvement store, her mind clear and focused. It was time to fortify her space, not just with the legal protections she had already put in place, but with tangible ones. A new privacy fence, cameras to monitor the property, and even a change of the Wi-Fi password. She wasn't going to leave anything to chance. As the days went on, the house began to shift along with the changes Helen had made. The new fence went up quickly, a strong barrier between her and the world outside. Cameras were installed, sleek and discreet, their lenses trained on every angle of the yard. It felt almost comforting to know she could monitor her space, to know no one could just walk in uninvited again. Helen sat down at the kitchen table one night, Liam beside her. They had just finished a batch of cookies, their favorite kind, and they were quiet, as they often were in moments like this. It was the first time in months that the house felt truly still. Liam reached over and unlocked his phone, then turned it toward Helen. On the screen was a photo of the two of them, baking together in the kitchen, laughing as flour dusted the countertops. It was a moment of peace, of simplicity. "I updated my wallpaper," Liam said, his eyes meeting hers. "It's us, you and me." Helen's heart swelled. "I like it," she said softly, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. "It's perfect." Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the trees. The house, once under siege, now stood firm. Helen had built her boundaries, her walls, and now there was nothing left but her peace. She had fought, she had won, and now there would be no more intrusions. New Year's Day arrived with a kind of crispness that seemed to match the quiet resolve Helen had been building over the past few months. The house, once filled with the noise and tension of unwanted visitors, now stood in calm defiance. The boundaries she'd set in place had taken root, and today, she was going to celebrate that, on her terms. Helen wasn't interested in a big, extravagant gathering. There would be no forced smiles, no empty gestures. This year it was about control, about choosing who would be in her space and who wouldn't. She stood in the kitchen, a pile of invitations in front of her, each one carefully crafted. "Marla, ever the practical one, had helped with the printing. The invitations were simple but pointed, each one reading, "Respect is RSVP." It wasn't just a reminder, it was a demand. Helen had taken the time to personally invite those who mattered, her neighbors, a few close friends who had shown her support. They were the people who respected her boundaries and knew the value of true companionship. This wasn't about playing nice with the ones who had only ever taken and never given. This was about drawing a line in the sand and making sure everyone knew where it stood. Marla arrived early to help with the final touches, her smile wide and unbothered. "Let me guess," she said, glancing at the stack of envelopes. "No family in sight?" "None," Helen replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "This is for the people who get it." Marla chuckled, popping a muffin into her mouth. "I like your style. Respect is earned, not handed out like party favors." They spent the morning putting the final details together, cleaning up, and preparing the food. Helen had made her famous roast, simple, yet perfect. And Marla had brought over a tray of pastries. It wasn't about quantity, it was about quality, about the people who truly mattered. As the clock ticked toward noon, the doorbell rang. Helen opened the door without hesitation, her face a careful mask of politeness as she greeted the first of the guests, a neighbor who lived a few doors down. There were smiles, light conversation, the clink of glasses, and a general sense of ease in the air. She could feel the weight of the past few months slowly lifting, replaced by a sense of peace that had been long overdue. But the quiet joy was soon interrupted. There was a knock at the door, louder, more persistent than before. Helen didn't even need to look through the peephole. She knew who it was. She opened the door to find Sean standing there, his posture uncertain, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His eyes were weary, but there was a hint of something else in his gaze, perhaps an apology, or maybe just the frustration of someone caught between two worlds. "Can we stop by just for a plate?" he asked, his voice tentative, almost apologetic. I just thought it might be okay." Helen stood in the doorway for a moment, her expression neutral, but inside she was weighing her options. The door, already slightly ajar, felt like the line between her past and present. Everything that had happened led to this moment. She folded her arms across her chest, taking a slow breath before speaking. "You can have whatever's left at the motel next door," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "I didn't invite you for a reason, Sean." Sean looked taken aback, his mouth opening and closing as if he didn't know how to respond. He glanced over his shoulder as though hoping for some support, but the street was empty. No backup, no safety net. Liam, who had been quietly watching the exchange from the living room, caught Helen's eye. He had a small smile on his face, but there was an unmistakable glint of pride in his eyes. "That was solid," he said, his voice low but full of approval. Helen winked at him, a small, knowing smile curving on her lips. "Solid is what's under the deed," she replied. The words were more than just a casual joke. They were the reality of what she had done, what she had built, and the finality of the boundaries she had set. The deed she had fought for, with all its legal power, was now the shield that protected her peace. And it had teeth. Sean looked at her, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out. After a long moment, he just nodded slowly, a mixture of defeat and disbelief in his gaze. Without another word, he turned and walked back down the steps, disappearing into the quiet of the street. The door clicked shut behind him. Helen didn't feel a surge of triumph or victory. Instead, she felt the quiet sense of calm that came with knowing she had stood her ground. The rest of the day passed with ease, the food eaten, the conversations light. The guests who had been invited remained, and the atmosphere was one of warmth and genuine connection. For the first time in a long time, Helen felt like she was truly home, safe, respected, and in control. Later that evening, as the last guests trickled out, Helen stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard. The world was still and quiet, but it was her world now. She had rebuilt it, step by step, and no one could take that from her. Liam stood beside her, sipping the last of his cocoa, his phone now locked away. He was no longer the quiet observer he once had been. Now he was part of the foundation Helen had built. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," he said again, the sincerity in his voice matching the quiet strength that had always been in her. Helen smiled softly, her gaze steady on the winter night. "I'm proud of you too," she said, her voice soft but certain. "We've made it through the storm, and now we get to live in the peace we deserve." And as the night deepened, Helen knew, for the first time in years, she could rest easy. The boundaries were in place, and her peace was hers to keep. The house was alive with warmth, the sounds of laughter floating through the air like a melody. It wasn't the raucous kind of laughter that filled a room with chaos. No, this was the kind of laughter that gently filled every corner, creating a sense of belonging, of ease. Helen moved quietly between the kitchen and the dining room, checking on the roast beef that had been slow-cooked to perfection. The potatoes, soft and golden, were sitting in their dish, just waiting for the right moment. The table was full, the plates heavy with food, and the room felt like home again. For the first time in months, the space felt right. Balanced, whole. No looming tension, no unresolved arguments. Just the quiet, content hum of a well-fed, well-cared-for group of people who respected each other. Helen smiled to herself as she placed the roast in the center of the table, the smell rich and comforting. Liam, standing beside her with his arms folded, was beaming. "It smells perfect," he said, watching her with that steady gaze of his that made her feel like everything was as it should be. "Just like you," she teased lightly, giving him a gentle nudge as he smiled back. It was a strange feeling, this peace. It wasn't the peace of avoidance or resignation, but the peace of having fought for what she deserved, fought for her own space, her own boundaries. The battle had been long and, at times, felt endless. But now, as the laughter flowed freely and the food was passed around, Helen could see that it had been worth it. Marla, sitting at the end of the table with a glass of wine in her hand, looked up, a mischievous smile on her lips. "To the one who served consequences like a 5-course meal," she said, raising her glass in a toast. The others around the table followed her lead, lifting their glasses in unison. Helen's heart swelled as she took her glass, her fingers brushing against the cool surface. The warmth in the room seemed to mirror the warmth in her chest, a long-held tension, finally released. She held up her glass, her voice steady, but filled with gratitude. "And dessert isn't denial," she said, her smile not just a reflection of the moment but of everything that had led to this point. The room was quiet for a moment, as everyone absorbed the meaning behind her words. It wasn't just about the food or the drink, it was about the recognition that Helen had done something important. She'd set the table, but she'd also set the terms of how things would be. No longer would she be the one who was walked over. She wasn't just serving dinner, she was serving justice, patience, and self-respect. The evening unfolded gently from there. No fights, no passive-aggressive comments, just conversation, the clink of silverware, and the occasional burst of laughter. Liam carved the turkey with an ease that made Helen smile. He was growing up, maturing into someone who understood the importance of moments like this, moments of quiet connection. As the meal came to a close, the table was quiet for a moment. No one in a rush, no one pressing for the next thing. It was a luxury she hadn't had in so long. The air was warm, heavy with satisfaction, but it wasn't the kind of satisfaction that filled you with regret or second thoughts. It was pure, clear contentment. Helen finally stood up and excused herself for a moment, walking to the window to look out at the peaceful street. The neighborhood was quiet, the night air still. She couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. Tonight she had reclaimed not just her house, but her peace. She had fought for it, and now it was hers to keep. She walked to the front door, locking it with the small click of finality. She smiled as she turned the key in the lock, feeling the weight of everything shift once more. This house, her home, was safe. Liam, his cocoa now finished, joined her at the door, his presence like a silent testament to everything she had done. His hand brushed against hers, and she didn't need to say a word. He had been by her side through it all. His unwavering support the anchor she had needed. With one final look around the house, Helen felt the rush of relief flood through her. She wasn't afraid anymore. No more intrusions. No more violations of her space. As they turned to head back to the kitchen, the door was locked behind them, the final guard in place. The laughter from the dinner table, the sound of glasses clinking, drifted softly toward them. The storm was over. And the calm that followed was the calm of victory, of self-respect, and of peace reclaimed. And as she closed the night with the sound of Liam's quiet laughter echoing in her mind, Helen knew this. No one would ever cross her again. My daughter-in-law's mother slapped the plate out of my hands at dinner, so I fed them the eviction papers instead.